Iran's supreme leader warns of a forceful response if the US or its allies bomb his country. That follows a threat made by US President Donald Trump if there's no deal on Tehran's nuclear program. How dangerous is this standoff, and can a solution be found? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. US President Donald Trump says that he'll bomb Iran if it won't agree a deal on its nuclear programme. Iran's vowed to strike back, describing Trump's warnings as an affront to international peace and security. That's the rhetoric of just the past few days. Hardly the mood music to suggest that the countries are close to an agreement. The one that was forged a decade ago was ripped up by Trump himself in 2018. He's pushing for another now in a region destabilised by Israel's genocide in Gaza. Iran's allies have been weakened too. The Assad regime toppled in Syria, Hezbollah hit hard by Israel, and Yemen's Houthis under direct attack by the US. For now, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for whom Iran has been enemy number one in his 4 decades in politics, appears to be able to act with impunity. So could the US really attack Iran? What are both Iran and the US really looking for from any deal? And what role is Israel playing in all of this? We'll talk to our guests shortly. But first, a report from Laura Khan.
Diplomacy by letter. This seems to be the current method of the US to engage with Iran over its nuclear program. A letter from US President Donald Trump to Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei had, in effect, 2 sides. One offering a possible window of engagement, the other a menu of threats.
We're going to make a decision on secondary tariffs on Iran based on whether or not they're going to make a deal. If they're going to make a deal, then we're never going to put secondary tariffs on.
Iran's initial response was a letter via Oman, before President Masoud Pezeshkian said he was ruling out direct but not indirect talks. Then the country's most powerful figure, the supreme leader, said that Iran would hit back if the US acted on its threats to bomb the country.
We have been hearing contrasting stances from Trump himself, discussing a negotiated resolution or making threats and increasing the sanctions, mixed signals coming from his administration officials.
Back in 2015, things were different. A historic deal signed by Iran with the West, Russia and China limited Iran's nuclear program to civilian use in return for sanctions relief. Trump collapsed the agreement in his first presidency in 2018. And since then, sanctions remained in place while Iran had abandoned the limitations it was observing on uranium enrichment. Trump had slapped 4 rounds of new sanctions on Iran since his return as president, with the latest intended to hit oil exports. Another blow for Tehran's economy, which had been struggling with surging inflation and a devaluating currency. And there have been fresh geopolitical setbacks for Iran too. It responded to attacks by Israel. But its ally Hezbollah has been weakened in Lebanon by Israeli action, while another, the Houthis in Yemen, have been attacked by the US. Israel's leader Benjamin Netanyahu has kept up threats against Iran, but all eyes are on the US and what it might decide to do.
The Iranians are right to be distrustful, I guess, given Trump's track record in withdrawing from a previous deal. But this is the beginning of a process.
While there's no signs of even talks yet, at least the process, however fragile, is underway. The US and its allies will be fully aware of the consequences of conflict with Iran, not just for the country and its people, but for the region and beyond. Laura Khan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Hassan Ahmadian is Assistant Professor at University of Tehran. He joins us now from Tehran. Ali Vaez is Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And Ellie Geranmayeh is Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on foreign relations. She joins us from London. A warm welcome to you all. Hassan, let's start with you. To what extent does President Trump have only himself to blame for the current situation? Iran was complying with the 2015 nuclear deal agreed with the US, EU, Russia and China before Trump collapsed it in 2018, wasn't it?
Well, that's exactly what the Iranians have been arguing and still are arguing. They're saying that there was a deal, Trump withdrew, and not only withdrew from the deal illegally, he imposed the maximum pressure campaign, which they now say we will not negotiate directly with the United States under it, because it's a matter of principle. If you agree to negotiate directly with the U.S., you're legitimizing, so the argument here goes, the maximum pressure campaign, which is illegal as per the JCPOA, the 2231 Security Council resolution. So yes, they are distrustful with the Trump administration, with Trump himself. The man is unreliable. The way the Iranians look at him. Look at how he treats his own allies and client states. He makes a deal and then he reneges on it and pushes further. So the Iranians do not want to see themselves in such a position, agreeing to a direct negotiation and then seeing him renege once more on a deal, a potential deal moving forward. They wanted indirect negotiations to caution themselves against such a behavior, which Trump is very well known for.
Hassan, many thanks. Ali, how dangerous a moment is this for Iran? What threat does Iran really pose?
It is a particularly dangerous moment, and the Iranian regime is facing with a confluence of crises, both domestic, given the degree of discontent at home, and also serious economic issues that the government is dealing with. The currency has lost half of its value since President Pezeshkian assumed office less than a year ago. They are literally struggling to keep the lights on. And in the region, of course, Iran has been weakened and Israel is in the ascendancy. And then the nuclear issue, of course, continues and will come to a head this year because the resolution, UN Security Council resolution that endorsed the agreement and has kept the Iran file in the Security Council for nearly 20 years, is going to expire this October. And unless there's some kind of a deal, the Europeans are going to snap back the UN sanctions. And Iran has threatened that if, in response, it would withdraw from the NPT. Now, you can imagine an advanced nuclear program with no international monitoring certainly crosses an Israeli and an American red line, which could result in military action against Iran just in the next few months.
Ellie, is there the political will to reach a solution here? To what extent are Trump and Iran talking aggressively, at least in public, while talking more diplomatically in private, albeit using indirect channels?
So look, I think it's clear that their opening gambit on both sides has been quite escalatory. There was a period of a few weeks at the beginning of the Trump administration where actually the leadership in Tehran and also those around Trump were quite disciplined in the language being used about this file. But since the US and President Trump announced the maximum pressure restored memo in February, the tone from Tehran has really changed to say that there will be no direct talks. But interestingly, all the messaging coming out with respect to the responding letter that Tehran has sent to President Trump via the Omanis indicates that Iran has left the door open for indirect talks, which may or may not happen through the channel that they have already established and are using at the moment via the European countries, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, who the Iranians met with a few days ago for a new round of technical talks regarding the nuclear file. So this may be one avenue. There are many mediators that have offered to facilitate these indirect talks, from President Putin, apparently, to the United Arab Emirates, to Saudi Arabia, to the Omanis. It does seem that with the candidate that Iran has chosen to send the letter back to President Trump, which is Oman, that they they may prefer a quieter diplomacy behind the scenes that will, at the beginning, hash out what is very important, which is what is the bottom line for the United States. I think from the Iranian side, it's more clear what they will and will not negotiate over and the context of that, but it's really unclear whether President Trump, for example, will accept that Iran enriches uranium on Iranian territory, or if he wants the so-called Libya model, which is dismantling all of Iranian's nuclear facilities, which will be a no-go for Iran. So these really critical endgame issues have to be hashed out. And probably history shows between Iran and US, this is better done through quiet diplomacy that is facilitated by a third party.
Hassan, despite the public statements that Iran is issuing, is there really the political will within the Iranian government to reach a solution? Can Iran afford not to make a deal right now?
Well, the Iranians have shown their will by sticking to their end of the deal back in 2015 to 2019. Basically, even after the United States and Trump himself withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iranians kept complying with the JCPOA. And afterwards, they entered into rounds of negotiations to revive it. And now the current administration is very clear in that they want a deal. They're not in a position that basically does not. They want a negotiated solution for this crisis. They don't want a confrontation. They don't want a country under sanctions. But this does not mean that they will succumb to what Trump wants. He basically is telling the Iranians to come to terms with his own conditions or preconditions. He doesn't want negotiations, according to many sources, according to what came out of his letter to Iran. He is telling the Iranians what he wants them to do. He's not willing to negotiate with them. And with that in mind, the Iranians will not get involved in any direct negotiations. I think that domestic discontent is very crucial here and is leading to miscalculus in Washington. I think the Iranians are not happy with their economic situation at this point. They want the sanctions to be lifted, but any foreign threat against the country would have a rally around the flag effect on the Iranians, and we hear it in public in different avenues in different places. No one wants Iran to succumb to what Trump wants. So a negotiated settlement is ideal, but it seems that at this point Trump is not eyeing such a outcome. He wants Iran to basically come to terms with what he wants, which the Iranians will not do in any circumstance.
Okay, we'll come back to the issue of trust in just a moment. But Ali, do you agree with that? If the US were to launch military strikes against Iran, would there be a rallying around the flag in Iran, or would its people simply not tolerate further economic hardship if its leaders didn't accept a deal and maximum pressure sanctions were reinstated against it?
Before I answer that question, let me just say, I think the picture that Hassan depicted is partial in the sense that, yes, there are people in the Trump administration who are seeking Iranian capitulation and a Libya model of Iran completely dismantling its nuclear program and even disarming in terms of its conventional military capabilities. And I agree that that's completely delusional and will never happen. But I don't think President Trump himself is pursuing maximalist demands. We have to understand that there's a clear distinction between President Trump and his administration. The former wants a mutually beneficial deal with Iran. The latter doesn't. And this is why it is a mistake for Iran to engage in indirect negotiations, which by definition will have to be conducted through mid-ranking to lower-ranking levels of the administration, rather than pursuing a top-down approach, which will bring in the one person in Washington who is actually interested in a mutually beneficial deal with Iran. And the Iranians have had this experience in Trump's first term, and apparently they have not learned the right lessons. In terms of implications of a military strike, look, this is not Iran of the 1980s, which was invaded by Saddam Hussein, its neighbor, and it created a rally around the flag effect. Of course, the Iranians are highly nationalistic people, and there will be a degree of rallying around the flag. But given the degree of loss of legitimacy in the Islamic Republic, given the fact that in the last election, only 40% of the Iranian people just last year came to the polls to elect President Pezeshkian, it really demonstrates that the degree of domestic malaise and discontent has reached historic highs. But I think there are certain elements within the Revolutionary Guards who would certainly benefit from a military confrontation with Israel and the US, because they know nothing short of a land invasion would be an existential threat to the regime. And so they will survive, and it would allow them to further monopolize political and economic power at a critical juncture in Iran's history when the question of the supreme leader's succession is looming large.
Ellie, where do you stand on that? Do we know what Trump's true intentions are? What would the US settle for? What kind of deal might satisfy Trump? A mutually acceptable deal? The full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, as US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has said, Iran's full submission, in other words, or a return to the JCPOA Accord of 2015 or JCPOA Plus, for instance. Could Trump even sell that as a win?
Let me start by saying I think the days of the JCPOA are over, and that is going to be an absolutely unsellable deal in the US and also in Iran these days, because the conditions around that deal have really shifted on both sides. But President Trump has maintained one consistent position on Iran, which is that he wants a deal on the nuclear issue and that he does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. But the president has shown to be a very chaotic communicator on not just Iran, but many, many different issues. So it's understandable that from hour to hour, folks in Tehran are trying to read the tea leaves and getting different messaging, particularly from those around President Trump. You mentioned Mike Waltz, who is on the much more hawkish side of the spectrum in the US system, saying that he wants the total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. But there have been other figures that are leading President Trump's diplomacy on really important files such as Ukraine, and that's Steve Witkoff, who has given several interviews in recent days, which has talked about ensuring that Iran's nuclear program is verified, that they have very strong verification mechanism. And I think that lends itself to a much more doable diplomatic track, which requires more intensive and transparent international monitoring of Iran's nuclear program, which I think could provide a win-win solution to both sides. But let me end by saying that the other pathway that President Trump has talked about and those around him keep threatening, which is the military solution, as they call it. Let's just be clear-eyed that this is not a silver bullet solution to the rapid progress that Iran's nuclear program has made, despite insistence on Israel from the Israeli side that they can take care of this problem militarily if there is US support. There is recent expertise and research shedding light on the fact that if there is, for example, a US-Israeli combined military effort in Iran, this would have to be repeated attacks every 6 months to set back potential Iranian revival of its nuclear program. So the US president would be dragging the United States into potentially one of those forever wars, which will require persistent US military footprint in the Middle East, which is something that even within his own administration, senior folks have vowed not to engage the US in.
We'll talk more about Israel in just a moment. But first, Hassan, what would Iran really settle for in any deal? I know you talked about this issue of trust. Why should Iran trust the Trump administration? But does Iran really understand Trump? Does it get him?
I'm not sure if the Americans themselves get Trump. They don't understand him. The Iranians really, they know that he wants a deal with them, but they don't really have a clear picture as to what he wants. And so they're saying that, and the President Pezeshkian, for instance, spoke about his responsibility of creating an atmosphere of trust before any negotiated settlement, because he was the person who reneged on an agreed upon deal and came up with the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And he is talking with that same rhetoric. There was this hope that he would learn from his first 4 years in dealing with Iran and come up with a different approach. I get Ali's point that there are different views, but so far what the Iranians have heard and received from Trump is not that different from what he was in 4 years ago. He's basically telling them, you have to get to a deal in 2 months or else. This is not the way you conduct a negotiation or a diplomatic approach to a very complicated issue such as the nuclear file, and the JCPOA is a very prime example of that. It continued for years before Iran and the P5+1 reached a deal. So you can't set a timeline. The way he's basically coming up with the issue tells the Iranians that he doesn't not only not understand the Iranians and their strategic culture, he doesn't understand what a negotiated settlement is. And ergo, what I said earlier, their perception is that Trump does not really want a deal. He wants Iran's capitulation. He wants Iran. That's why he's not, bringing up his clear, end game in this. What Ellie mentioned, I agree with, that there is no clear, image as to what Trump administration wants. You hear different messages from different parts of the administration, but what came to the Iranians directly by the president and his letter is quite, out of the diplomatic approach that the Iranians were eyeing when electing President Pezeshkian and telling moving towards the diplomatic side of dealing with the United States directly or indirectly. So what their insistence on indirect negotiations with Trump is not really that big of a deal. What's the core of the issue is that his approach is not clear. We need to understand what he wants, and then we can discuss.
Ali, do you agree with that? Does President Trump understand? He's repeatedly said that he wants a deal with Iran. Of course, the question is what sort of deal? To what extent is he being manipulated, do you think, by hawks within his administration? Is anyone within his inner circle cautioning against the use of military force due to the impact that it would have on the wider region, perhaps? And what pressure do you think Israel is able to apply right now on the White House?
Look, there are much less restraints on this president this time around than has ever been the case. And it's not clear to me at all that push comes to shove. And if he believes that Iran is taking steps towards weaponization, that he would take military action. Or if Israel starts a conflict with Iran that it cannot finish, then the United States would be dragged into a war with Iran with catastrophic regional implications. But I think instead of speculating about whether Trump, who has written a book about his negotiating strategy, which often starts with threats and bullying and asks for the sun, but he is willing to settle for the moon. And Iranians would never know this until they try it out. They don't have much to lose by trying it out. And again, I understand why they want to engage in indirect negotiations. But again, as I said, indirect negotiations usually take a very, very long time. And we only have a period about 2.5 months, not because of Trump's deadline, but because of, as I said, the approaching deadline of reimposition of UN sanctions, which in and of itself would further complicate the task of resolving this issue diplomatically. And usually the pace of negotiations with Iran are slow and slower. So in 2.5 months, if you want to do it indirectly, it's really a formula for disaster. And at the end of the day, if Iran engages with President Trump, yes, there is a political cost, but all the leverage that Iran has today, which is that it can basically enrich an arsenal worth of fissile material in the course of a month, that leverage is still going to be there, even if it realizes that what Trump wants is absolutely not workable.
Ellie, is this the moment that Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu has been waiting for? How is this current situation playing into his hands? And how might Israel react? You hinted at it in your last answer, to any deal which essentially kicks the can down the road and allows Iran to save face.
So I think what has happened is, for the time being, the United States, under President Trump's authority, has given a red light to Netanyahu for any Israeli military action in Iran while the course of diplomacy is tested. The problem here is, as Ali mentioned, negotiations between the US and Iran get slower and slower the more time goes on. We've seen this in previous administrations. So if we are entering a field where by the end of the summer, we're in a situation where very little progress has been made diplomatically, I think we really risk a scenario in which the European parties that are remaining in the nuclear deal, the 2015 nuclear deal, use their right for snapback in late summer to basically say that Iran is not in compliance with its nuclear commitments. And then there is a real crisis moment at the Security Council level, to which Iran is very likely to produce a withdrawal from the NPT treaty. And at that moment, I think, is the moment that Bibi Netanyahu leaps into the White House and says, look, Mr. President, you have let diplomacy run its course. Iran has continually rejected and escalated. Now is the window to strike Iran militarily, to set back its nuclear capabilities while we figure out what else to do on this front. There is another worry, by the way, I should add, that given the unchecked Israeli military actions in the region in the past year, that Israel will also consider, in addition to nuclear facilities, to also strike at Iran's energy sites, its military sites, but also its leadership structure. This is something we've seen with Hamas, with Hezbollah. This is the playbook that the Trump administration is now using against the Houthis in Yemen. So I think these are all things that Tehran should be alert to. And the fact that the more time is wasted at this particular juncture on engaging directly with the White House and directly with senior administration officials in the US, the more room this opens up for Netanyahu and those who want to see a military confrontation between the US and Iran to make that case much more successfully to the president.
There, I'm afraid we must leave it. Many thanks indeed to you all. Hassan, Ahmadian, Ali Vaez, and Ellie Geranmayeh. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. It's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us on our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha, we'll see you again. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.